My manager used to put his hands under the desk and squeeze my knees.
She used to call me at like 3 in the morning after a night out and ask me to come around.
And they asked if I was late because I'd been sucking someone off.
He assured me that if I didn't stay back with him, I wouldn't get promoted.
Once he kept touching my hair, making me feel really uncomfortable.
The truth is, it'd be more of a problem for me if I said something.
Every day there was, you look well for a boy now.
I asked him to stop, but he never listened.
Hello everyone, thank you for having us. My name is Shilpen Savani, this is Jerry, who many of you know. We're here to talk to you about something that we really care about, and I hope by the end of the next few minutes you'll care about it too. But first and foremost, I'd like to say that this is an initiative that's been backed by a lot of others basically, so this is very much a team effort. And one person I'd like to mention specifically is Daniel Tatton-Brown QC, one of the finest employment lawyers and a man of extreme integrity, who has contributed to the project and supported it and really added a lot to what we're asking your industry to accept. Jerry, without further ado.
Awesome. So I'm glad we started the day with a bit of humour because I feel like as a white man, I'm allowed to stand up in front of you and talk about something I know very little about, and society will accept that, which is good, because I'm about to do that. I've been on a journey on this. So NDAs, non-disclosure agreement, what on earth are we here to talk about? For me, an NDA is something you sign when you're going into the Facebook or the Google offices and you want to get a free lunch. Best gluten-free breakfast in all of London, Facebook used to do. Or for most of us, an NDA is a perfectly reasonable part of how we do business. If you're working with an agency, a partner, there are lots of things we do in our lives that we don't want in our business lives that we quite rightly don't want to be public knowledge, that we need to have ways of working with people, we need to have ways of sharing. All of those are sort of perfectly reasonable, good, great uses of these non-disclosure agreements. But what we've learned over the last year or two, and some of you have known this for a lot longer, I suspect, is that there's sort of a darker side to which how NDAs are sometimes used within our industry, and especially how individual personal NDAs are used. And it's kind of part of a sort of a systematic silencing of the vulnerable and victims of our industry. And as you saw from that kind of Time 2 video, in particular, people who've been affected by sexual abuse or just bad workplace behaviour, we have a sort of a systematic assumption that we will quietly silence that person and move them along. Many of you, most of you probably saw this article written by Zoe Scaman about 9 months ago, MadMen and Furious Women. It's a hard read, but it's an important read. It talks about a lot of shit that goes down in our industry, quite a lot of it with agencies, some of it with brands across our entire industry. Often women, but not exclusively women, affected by stuff that you shouldn't have to experience at work. And we ended up on an email of 20 or 30 people kind of chatting about this and what can we do about it, and Zoe's been part of it. And really, we just sort of said as a motley crew, how do we do something about this? How do we challenge this? Now, it's this systematic response. It's this systematic idea that, you know, the best thing to do is kind of hush, hush, keep quiet, pay a person off, move them on. It hadn't really occurred to me that it was an issue at all. And actually, over the last couple of years, a couple of things I've been doing, I did the Bloom Exchange. I think you might be just too late to apply for this year, but if not, a fantastic thing as a man or a non-binary person, spend time with some of the women in our industry, listen to them. Also working with Outvertising, who work with LGBT people, because this kind of workplace misbehavior does predominantly affect some of the people who are in other ways minorities in their life. And we've heard stories of people who weren't just affected by bad behavior in the office, but whose NDAs kind of came to haunt them. Now, don't get me wrong, we're not saying that, you know, NDAs are the sort of the root of the problem. The root of the problem is clearly bad behavior, and we need to change that. There are lots of other things, and the Time 2 initiative, which is kind of we sort of splintered as a part of, really endorses that. What we found is that NDAs have two really fundamental problems with them that they drive within industry. First of all, they protect the people who are doing bad in our industry, people who, you know, may continue to work in that company and re-offend, if that's the right word, or who might, even in cases where that same person has followed the victim to other companies and there's not been anything they can say. Perhaps even more than that, we've heard quite a lot of stories how being put under an NDA is in itself almost an ongoing trauma and almost an ongoing issue. You feel isolated. There are NDAs where you can't speak to any of the colleagues at your old work. You can't talk to your friends about why you've left your job. You can't, the way it's interpreted by people, you can't talk to therapists. You might even feel you can't talk to the police about it, a lot of which isn't true. And I guess we're here today to educate people around the fact that this is an issue, because when I started, the great ISBA D&I team had me come in and we talked about this a little bit, and most people in the room were like, I didn't even know this was a thing, I didn't even know this was an issue. For those of you who've been affected by it, especially if you've been an affected person, you're probably painfully aware it's an issue. So we kind of want to start by educating people, equipping them with that knowledge, pointing towards Nabs and some of the resources they provide if you ever find yourself in that situation. But more actively, we want to call on marketing organizations, brands, agencies, everyone involved to start adopting fair NDA clauses. And because I have almost no idea what one of those would be, I will pass back to the legal mastermind, Shilpen.
Thanks, Jerry. I'm not sure about the mastermind bit. But, I mean, I think the important thing to realize with NDAs is they are lawful. And I think it's also important to recognize that whether you realize it or not, or whether you've appreciated it or not, everyone in this room has signed a secrecy clause at some point. So really, what we're pinpointing here is something that is very much a normal part of our working lives. And as Jerry said, we've all signed these NDAs when we're going in for a free lunch or for a party somewhere. In my day job, I deal with a lot of workplace problems, and very often that will lead to disputes, and they tend to go in one of two ways. You either end up in the employment tribunal, and that is something that's decided by the court, by a judge, and in the full glare of publicity. There's nowhere to hide. You take your chances. If you're right, you're right. If you're wrong, you're wrong. And everyone is hauled into the glare, basically. But the vast majority of disputes tend to be settled, and I'll try not to bore you too much, but that leads to something that's called a settlement agreement. A settlement agreement is essentially a contract with a few bells and whistles. And it's when you come to these contracts that there is a lot of scope for abuse, basically, right now. There's 4 asks that we have, and they are actually quite simple, but they're game-changing if they're implemented. The first one is absolute freedom to report workplace harassment. Now, you would quite fairly and understandably think that this is something that already exists. It does to an extent, but there's a lot of ifs and buts. It's not a clear-cut ability. And what we're saying is it's a very common sense thing to do. If you believe in what we're saying and you want to avoid some of the abuse that's happening, often inadvertently, there should be zero tolerance or zero obstacles and repercussions from reporting harassment. And that can be to an authority, but it can also be to your next employer. It could be to anyone that can make a difference. The next one, again, needs a little bit of explaining, but really this is that very often compensation is paid. A settlement, by its nature, is probably going to involve some compensation. And the most important thing to recognize here is that it's normally for past deeds, basically. The complaint, the dispute, the spat, whatever it is, has already happened, basically, most of the time. So when there's a settlement that's reached, it's for things that have already happened. But when you come to these agreements, there's a steady creep of reputation protection and other things that start to come in, basically. And there's almost an unspoken trade-off, which is if the employee wants the payment that you've fought hard to get, you're going to have to accept these terms, basically. Just take it. You've got no choice. Take it or leave it. And I think the most important thing to explain here is that even a small breach of a clause like this can actually put an employee in a position where they have to repay their entire compensation. Plus, if they choose to have an argument and make a stand, they have to pay the legal fees for the privilege of doing that, as in the legal fees of their ex-employer to have the dispute, which means in reality, you're being completely gagged, and that's the point. Workers should be independently advised before accepting an NDA. That's already a feature of settlement agreements. But as I mentioned earlier, everyone here has signed a secrecy clause of some type or other, and you've probably never given it much thought. But there is a limit to where a clause like this should go, and there's a limit to how much protection it should offer an employer. And the way to fix this is that every time an employer asks an employee to accept an NDA, in whichever form it is, it's some form of contractual clause that limits what you can say. The least thing you should be offered is the opportunity to take independent advice, and for that to be by a lawyer of your choice, and for the fees of which should be met by the employer. Because without that, it doesn't mean anything, unless you can actually provide the means to get the advice that you're asking them to take. The fourth and final, but by no means least of these, is actually a real oddity. Protection of reputation should apply to the employer only. You might say that's completely logical. But, and it is logical because most times claims and disputes that arise name the employer and nobody else. If they do name individuals, those are the alleged perpetrators of what's gone wrong in the first place. But what you find happens here is when a deal is done, I mean, I've seen agreements like this where an employer will not only protect the agency, for example, but also the entire group. And think of some of the large agencies that are out there that own multiple agencies. It extends to all officers, all employees, all contractors, and even shareholders. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. So that an individual could be gagged from saying anything about people they've never even met, let alone the actual perpetrators who can inadvertently be shielded by this. And that's why it's so important. So what we're asking for here is hopefully to raise some awareness and to make you aware of why so many of us care about this and why you should as well. And for those employers and decision makers out there, I really want them to pay attention to this because these are small changes, but they're game changing and it could remove an awful lot of abuse that's happening right now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, we just... oh, yes. And I would just say we've got some great creative, actually driven by wonderful creative director Joe Wallace, who you just heard a few minutes ago. It's launching today on the Nabs blog, some of the Nabs social media. I think Campaign are running it as an article. Our starting point, as Shilpen just said, is trying to get people aware that this is an issue, that this is something that they can look for support in. We would love it if you guys could look out for that stuff. Go to the Nabs social page over the coming hours, retweet it, share it, take some of the creatives from the campaign launch story, share them on your own page. We do have a desk over there. We have some very stylish t-shirts as well we'd love to give out to you. And if you want to ask loads of tough questions, Shilpen may be available.
Thanks, Jerry. And just a final point again, sorry to kind of make this point again, but this message is really for the decision makers in your industry. Because if you get it and you sign up to these things, then they're deliberately designed to be palatable and to be acceptable to you. And once you do that, you'll be telling your lawyers that as well. And that is when I'll see if it's made a difference or not, basically. Thank you.